So I'm not a person that watches very many TV shows or movies, even the really good ones. I don't know why this is. I guess I'm just missing a gene. But every so often, I overcome my genes and get successfully lured in by something. And one such something was the Netflix show, The Crown. But not just The Crown Season 4. And not just The Crown Season 4, but The Crown Season 4, Episode 2, The Balmoral Test. I had listened to a podcast recently that was really raving about this particular episode, so I decided to take a little look-see for myself. And I found it such a remarkable piece of storytelling that I just had to make a video about it, so here we go. So the episode tells the story of the time Queen Elizabeth II and the rest of the British royal family invited Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher to spend the weekend with them at Balmoral Castle, which is up in rural Scotland. And what makes this episode so great is that it would work even if none of these people actually existed in real life. Because at the end of the day, this episode is not really about historical figures or historical events, but rather is an allegory about class. The Queen and her family are portrayed as representatives of the culture and values of the most extreme upper class, in this case, the highest ranking hereditary aristocrats in the entire United Kingdom, while Margaret Thatcher and her husband are stand-ins for the culture and values of the British middle class, the class of anxious workers and strivers. And the lesson that the audience learns from this episode is that the middle class is better. Or, at the very least, in any conflict between the upper class and the middle class, it is pretty clear why the middle class will always triumph. So before we begin, it is important to understand what we mean when we are talking about the values and cultures of these two classes. A while ago, I made an award-winning video about my own affinity for the middle-class way of life, which is the standard of life I enjoy, and probably most of you guys enjoy as well. You know, this sort of life where you have to work for a living, but also make enough money to have nice things, like a decent car and a big television and Uber Eats for dinner. And I identified a few of the most stereotypical personality traits that tend to be associated with achieving and maintaining this particular way of life. The big one is that middle-class people generally attribute the comfortable status of their lives to like their good work habits and their ability to follow the rules and their general good manners and skill at getting along with others. Middle-class people often tell a very sentimentalized personal story about how their family came from humble beginnings and how it was through hard work and good values that they got where they are today. At the same time, however, this middle-class focus on doing what it takes can also breed a lot of anxiety. The great middle-class fear is that doing the wrong thing could make them slide down a peg on the old class scale, both financially, but perhaps just as importantly, socially as well. Now, in contrast to the middle class, people in the extreme upper class have much less of this sort of anxiety. These are generally people who have enjoyed enormous wealth their entire lives and were often directly born into society's elite tier. This means upper class people tend to be way more complacent or even indifferent about their financial and social status. They don't have to prove anything to anyone and they can take what they have for granted. That's not to say that upper class people don't have any anxieties of their own, but in general, the stuff that preoccupies the lives of the upper class are really quite exotic and difficult for middle class people to understand. Which brings us to the episode. So Margaret Thatcher is the recently elected Prime Minister of Great Britain. She is possibly the most middle-classy Prime Minister in British history up to that point, both in terms of her personal background, her political agenda, and the sort of people who elected her. And as a result, when she and her husband Dennis first arrive at Balmoral Castle, they are immediately intimidated by how grand everything is and all of the weird new upper-class rules.
Unpacking your bag? What was she thinking? That's her wife's job. And 2 bedrooms.
I know, it's all very odd.
Are we allowed to sleep in one bed?
I shall go and check with the protocol sheet.
As representatives of the middle class, the Thatchers expect everything in life to be strictly functional and practical, and get baffled by procedures that seem to embrace pointless luxury. Pointless luxury is, of course, very much at odds with the sort of thriftiness and financial caution that middle-class people value so highly. So already we are seeing that the world of the upper class is one with plenty of rules and traditions, but but they're not rational or functional in the way that the rules of the middle class are. We get another great example of this when the Thatchers head downstairs to have dinner with the royal family. Obviously, having dinner with the royals is a very big deal to the Thatchers, probably one of the biggest deals of their lives up until that point. So, like the anxious middle-class couple they are, they want to do everything right and make a good first impression. They've heard that the royals can be extremely judgmental of their guests.
What do we wear?
What the heck? Who cares?
I care. Every house has rules, and places like this are all about what you wear and when.
So they put on their best clothes and show up to the dining room early, only to be greeted by...
Some are on the grass floor, so therefore you know it's true. What are they doing? Christ. Prime Minister, how nice to see you.
When they actually do have dinner, the Thatchers are once again shocked to see how rudely and snobbishly the royals behave. No middle-class politeness here, because the royals have nothing to prove to anyone. Certainly not to some random woman from Grantham. Now, throughout this episode, the royals are portrayed as being obsessed with a project to stalk a wild stag on their sprawling property. There are some passing references to why this matters to them, but it mostly just serves as a stand-in for the kind of weird hobbies that upper class people have. The next morning, the Queen invites Thatcher to come along with them on the stalk, and Thatcher is once again humiliated for dressing all wrong for this strange invitation, despite clearly trying so hard to do it right. And as they drive into the countryside, there is this wonderful scene where these two women, who are about the same age but come from such vastly different worlds, have a little exchange about their fathers.
I'm afraid we're all mad stalkers. It was how I spent some of the happiest times with my father, King George. He taught me everything.
Oh, my father taught me a great deal too.
Hey, what did you do together?
We worked.
The real-life Margaret Thatcher deeply idolized her father, who ran a grocery store that she helped out at. Thatcher saw her father as a man who embodied all that was good about the British middle class. He provided for his family and community, he was thrifty, he was self-made, and most of all, he worked incredibly hard. This theme that the middle class values work, while the upper class values leisure, comes up a lot in this episode. Thatcher very quickly concludes that this entire holiday at Balmoral is a big waste of time, distracting her from the pressing business of running the British government, which is of course not only her job, but her whole identity as a person. The royals, meanwhile, don't really have jobs, which means that they have a lot more respect for people who are able to enjoy leisure activities in a competent and engaged fashion. So needless to say, there is a huge values clash here, and the royals wind up having nothing but contempt for Thatcher, who doesn't know how to stalk, who puts no effort into their boozy parlor games, who doesn't enjoy her time at the caber toss, and is generally just a big sourpuss the whole time. Another great scene comes when Princess Margaret, ably played by Helena Bonham Carter, confronts Thatcher in the middle of trying to get some work done. And of course, she is doing everything wrong once again.
What are you doing?
Your Royal Highness.
Aren't you supposed to be out there stalking?
Yes, I was, but your sister
No, you
agreed
don't call
that
her
I should-
that. You call her the Queen. She's the Queen, not my sister. And that chair, no one sits in that chair.
Oh, I beg your pardon.
God, don't say that either. Say what? Begging for anything is desperate. Begging for pardon is common.
The Thatchers wind up leaving early, clearly glad to be out of this middle-class nightmare, a world where they don't know how to impress anyone and are constantly being judged for stupid, irrational things. The denouement of the episode features Lady Diana coming to the castle, where, in contrast to the Thatchers, she wows everyone easily. As a fellow member of the British upper class, Diana knows how to stalk and play the parlor games and be an amusingly superficial dinner guest. And all of the other royals are, of course, very impressed with Diana, a woman who Princess Anne calls absolutely perfect.
In age, looks, and breeding.
And they all conclude that Prince Charles, the Queen's oldest son, should therefore marry Diana. Does Charles love Diana? Clearly not, since we often see him chatting on the phone with Camilla Parker Bowles, the woman he is actually in love with. But once again, the upper class are not preoccupied with being practical or rational the way that the middle class are. Charles needs a wife who will fit in with the culture of the royal family and Diana is clearly it. I mean, it's not like they have to sleep together or anything. Earlier in the episode, we see that the Queen and her husband don't even sleep together.
Good night.
All of this sits in contrast to the Thatcher's marriage, which is portrayed as a very loving and logical partnership. Right after the scene where Philip goes to his separate room, there is a scene where Thatcher really doesn't want Dennis to sleep in a separate bed, even though they have 2 bedrooms in the castle and she is very busy that night. To an anxious middle-class woman like Thatcher, a relationship can never be taken for granted and instead requires constant work, just like everything else in life.
Why don't I go and sleep in the other room?
Don't you dare. They don't want to catch any upper-class habits. Those that sleep apart grow apart.
It's just for one night.
Yes, and that's precisely how bad habits start. You can stay here.
Now, the final 3 scenes of the episode are kind of magnificent because they show 3 starkly different visions of dreams coming true. In the first one, Margaret Thatcher returns to work and fires all of the rebellious cabinet ministers who are standing in the way of her budget cuts. She now has the administration of her dreams to help get Britain's finances back in working order. In the second scene, the royal servants mount the head of the stag, which they have finally managed to kill, and it is even bigger and grander than the stag head they already had. And lastly, we see Lady Diana, who is now clearly becoming increasingly well known to the public as she gets in deeper and deeper with the royal family. She politely tolerates the paparazzi photographers that we know will proceed to make her life a living hell and eventually kill her. So which dream seems better? So I've often thought about making a video about Queen Elizabeth someday, seeking to answer the question, has she been a good queen? My understanding is that this is the question the entire series of The Crown seeks to answer, and let me know in the comments what you think the show's ultimate conclusion is. But based on this one episode's admittedly fictionalized depiction, I think it is hard to avoid saying no, Queen Elizabeth has not been a good queen because she has lived a life guided by upper-class values that are not worth admiring. Her family is one of fabulous unearned wealth and power, which has allowed their lives to become corrupted by a kind of pointless idleness. Lives that contain a great deal of tradition and routine, but none of it in the service of anything beyond their own pleasure and self-perpetuation. Such lives may be fascinating and glamorous to observe from afar, but the more you learn about them, the less you would want to trade places with them. 200 years from now, I think it will be easy for middle-class people of the future to immediately appreciate Margaret Thatcher, even if they don't agree with her politics. Thatcher was a fiercely principled and hard-working woman who rose from modest beginnings to become the first female prime minister in British history. Through grit and determination, she attempted to redirect the British government towards certain idealized middle-class values like fiscal responsibility and respect for the law. How will people of the future regard Queen Elizabeth in contrast? Well, she was a queen. She did the job she was born into and upheld the rituals and traditions of her upper-class family, and thereby helped ensure the monarchy retained its aloof and unchanging presence in British life. But was that a worthwhile project? Who is the better role model? Who lived the better life?
You have a brand new cabinet.
I have.
Mostly older ministers that were culled.
Yes, although it wasn't just their age that decided it.
Rather,
Their background, mostly, and lack of grit, as a consequence of their privilege and entitlement.
always a mistake to assume just because people are privileged, they lack grit. And a dangerous game, I think, to make enemies left, right, and centre.
Not if one is comfortable with having enemies.
Are you?
Oh, yes. Inspired by the words of the Chartist poet Charles Mackay. You have no enemies, you say. Alas, my friend, the boast is poor. He who is mingled in the fray of duty that the brave endure must have made foes. If you have none, small is the work that you have done.